Now, let's consider about the risk. If you think about risk, nothing in life is safe. When crossing the road, there is a risk that you may hit by a running car. So, normally in life, we accept low levels of risk, and when it comes to the higher levels of risk, we try to avoid it. However, understanding the risk and their causes is important to deal with any kind of uncertainties, as in the case of disasters. It is interesting to understand the origin of the term risk. In Arabic, risk means anything that has been given to you, like by God, and from which you get or you make some profit out of it. So it has more of a positive meaning, which implies fortune or opportunity. Whereas Latin origin of the term riscum, which implies a scenario faced by sailors attempting to circumvent the danger posed by a barrier reef. So, which means that it is more of a stressful situation and which has more of negative meaning. So, in terms of disaster management or disaster, the usage of risk is more closer to this condition where you have a stressful situation and which always have a negative meaning. So reducing risk of disease, that was the greatest social achievement of the last century. For example, the average life expectancy in Europe during 1841 was about 35 years. Now, in most high income countries, it is over 70 years, and it is over 50 years even in the least developed or poorest countries. So, when we think about risk, its drivers or stressors are keep on accumulating within an area, which means that the stresses are continuously building, and the capacity of the area to accept the stresses is not increasing, or rather it is not keeping in pace. So it is likely that beyond a point the system will break. So that is the case that's happening in terms of natural disasters. The United Nations definition of the risk involves the probability of harmful consequences, which include casualties, damaged property, lost livelihoods, disrupted economic activity, and damage to the environment, which results from interaction between natural or human induced hazards and vulnerable conditions. So, risk may be also defined as expected losses from a hazard to a given element at risk over a specified future time period. So, risk may be measured in terms of expected economic loss, number of lives lost, or the extent of physical damage to the property. So, there are a number of ways you may express the loss due to a disaster. Like, for example, 25,000 lives lost over a 30-year period, or you may also say that 75,000 houses experience severe damage within last 25 years. Or this is more of giving exact figures, or you could express it alternatively on a probabilistic basis, like a 70% probability of economic losses to property exceeding $50 million in a town within the next 10 years. That is another way of expressing the risk. So the risk in the context of hazard, its exposure and vulnerability may be expressed in number of ways. When presence of humans made into the area where there is a higher probability of a hazard occurs. So we make choices as to where we inhibit, like in hazard prone areas where we try to build and set up an establishment. So the risk is the combination of hazard, exposure and vulnerability. Death, loss and damage, which is a function of the context of hazard, exposure and vulnerability. So the terms hazard, exposure and vulnerability is what that contributes to the condition of a risk during a hazard in an area, which makes into a disaster. So it is appropriate to define risk as a likelihood of an event occurring multiplied by the consequences of that event. So if you say what is likelihood, it may be given as a probability or frequency, whichever is appropriate for the analysis under consideration. So the probability may be the single event scenarios which is having a value ranging between 0 and 1, with 0 indicates 0 chances of occurrence, with 1 indicates the certain occurrence. Whereas frequency denotes the number of times an event will occur within an established sample size over a specific period of time. So it tells us how frequently an event can occur in an area. Risks can never be eliminated from an area during a hazard, but it can be managed and the likely consequence may be reduced at a minimal cost compared to the cost of reinstating the community or establishment after hitting by a hazard. So defining risk tolerance allows informed, cost-effective risk management decisions. Risk is a phenomenon that affects everyone in the community. It is no longer the sole responsibility of the persons involved. So when you think about risk management, it lies in the knowledge of the hazards and the physical, social, economic and environmental vulnerabilities and the ways in which hazards and vulnerabilities are changing in the short and long term. It has two parts for managing a disaster, that is risk assessment and risk evaluation. The risk assessment involves scientific quantification of risk from data and understanding the processes involved. Whereas risk evaluation, which include the social and political judgment of the importance of various risks by the individuals and communities that face the disaster. There is always a trade-off between perceived risk against potential benefits and balancing scientific judgment against other factors of belief is necessary while doing the risk management. Quantifying the risk by gathering the data on the effects of hazards that cause the risk and on the basis of statistical analysis, it is possible to predict the possibility or probability of the disaster in the future.